Thank you all for joining us today for the exciting release and discussion of our joint report on why New Jersey needs a state-specific Voting Rights Act. At a time when voting rights are being attacked across the country on nearly every level, it's more important than ever to protect the right to vote where and when we can. Our report comes at a time when the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965 has been weakened and continues to be challenged. The federal VRA is a landmark piece of legislation. At its height, the VRA was considered one of the most effective pieces of civil rights law that this country has ever enacted. It was passed on August 6, 1965, after decades of organizing by Black activists, including the late Congressman John R. Lewis. The VRA just celebrated its 58th anniversary. It's with this legacy in mind that the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, the Legal Defense Fund, and the Election Law Clinic at Harvard Law School came together to jointly explore New Jersey's own history of voter protection and voter suppression, and explore the case for why New Jersey could benefit from a state-specific Voting Rights Act and what that might look like. The report is being released in its entirety today and will be linked at the end of this presentation. So my name is Nuzhat Chowdhury, and I am Senior Counsel with the Democracy and Justice Program at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. The Institute is a racial justice and social justice organization that uses independent advocacy to empower people of color by building reparative systems that create wealth, transform justice, and harness democratic power from the ground up in New Jersey. This includes by advocating for equal and expanded access to voting and creating a more inclusive democracy in New Jersey. Some of the Institute's democracy campaigns include the fight for same-day voter registration, jury service for formerly incarcerated individuals, lowering the voting age for local elections, and of course, the need for a New Jersey Voting Rights Act. Today, I'm excited to be joined by two of my fellow contributors to the NJVRANOW report. Adam Lioz is Senior Policy Counsel for Political Participation at the Legal Defense Fund, where he works to build an inclusive, multiracial democracy. Since joining LDF in 2021, Adam has coordinated LDF's work for state voting rights acts across the country, including the successful advocacy for comprehensive state voting rights acts in New York and Connecticut. Ruth Greenwood is the director of the Election Law Clinic at Harvard Law School. Ruth has engaged in litigation and advocacy on a variety of election law cases while training the next generation of election lawyers. She has litigated two partisan gerrymandering cases from the trial level to the US Supreme Court and has also litigated minority vote dilution claims under state and federal voting rights acts. I'm excited to have Ruth and Adam share their expertise a little later on. Finally, before we begin, one bit of housekeeping. We will have 15 minutes at the end of the webinar for a Q&A. We welcome you to use the Zoom Q&A function to ask your questions as we go along, and then we will answer as many questions as we can at the end. So thank you for joining us, and we can begin. So I think to begin with, it's important to situate where New Jersey is in the conversation about voting and voting rights. When it comes to democracy, New Jersey is often considered to have a pretty good track record. And it's true that the state has passed good pro-democracy measures recently. However, its history might actually surprise you. Originally, New Jersey gave one of the broadest grants of voting rights to its residents. The 1776 Constitution had no restrictions based on color or sex or even citizenship. And in 1790, the New Jersey legislature made this even more explicit with regard to gender. The state legislature amended the Constitution's language to make it clear that both men and women could vote at that time. Unfortunately, less than 20 years later, the legislature rolled all of this back. It amended that same law to restrict voting to white, tax-paying male citizens only, and in the process of doing so, made New Jersey one of the first states in the North to restrict the franchise of voting in this particular manner. Next slide, please. Thanks. Oh, one slide back. There we go. So New Jersey restricted the right to vote to white males only, and then continued to restrict the right to vote even further. In 1844, the state legislature restricted access to the ballot by passing a broad felony disenfranchisement law. So this law prohibited people with criminal convictions from voting, and it included such minor offenses as forgery and larceny. To this day, New Jersey has the worst racial disparity rate among its incarcerated population. So until 2019, this 1844 law was used to disproportionately disenfranchise Black and Brown individuals with criminal convictions. It crystallized racial exclusion in the New Jersey Constitution itself. Even in the midst of the Civil War, New Jersey opposed the Emancipation Proclamation. And after the Civil War, the state refused to ratify the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, or what is otherwise known as the Reconstruction Amendments. What this means is that New Jersey was actually the last northern state to abolish slavery in 1866. In addition to that, New Jersey, still not done. Thanks. So in addition to that, New Jersey also didn't ratify the 15th Amendment. And this is important because the 15th Amendment protected the vote for all males regardless of their race. And the state didn't ratify the 15th Amendment to do so until Congress had already enacted it in 1870, and the amendment was a part of the US Constitution. So it was only at that point in 1870 that Black males received the right to vote in New Jersey again. Next slide now. So today, New Jersey voters, and particularly voters of color, still face persistent obstacles when going to cast their vote. Many of these issues continue to disproportionately impact Black and other voters of color, primarily because of where these issues chronically occur the most. So for example, from election to election, we see that Newark has chronic problems with delayed poll openings and long lines. Newark is a city of 77% people of color with a 48% Black population. So when Newark voters face these chronic problems, that means it's largely voters of color that are facing these issues. And across every election, we see these sorts of voting access problems in other areas in New Jersey with large people of color populations across the state. Another persistent and widespread problem that New Jersey voters face is lack of language access at the polls. So although 1/3 of New Jersey residents speak a language other than English, the state often is found in violation of language access protections. In fact, the Department of Justice, the DOJ, has sued multiple New Jersey counties over violating language access protections in the federal VRA itself. The most recent of these cases was just this year. In March of 2023, the DOJ entered into a consent decree with Union County related to the availability of election assistance and providing materials in Spanish for Spanish speakers. Currently, the only languages that the New Jersey online voter registration website offers are Korean, Spanish, English, and Gujarati. So this leaves out many sizable language minority populations in New Jersey, and it keeps those voters who have limited English proficiency from being able to register comfortably in their own language. Another serious and constant problem that is worth mentioning is that New Jersey voters face barriers to meaningful physical access to polling locations. So a recent study done by the US Election Assistance Commission found that New Jersey voters with disabilities had a 7.5% lower voter turnout during the 2020 elections than voters without disabilities. This is unsurprising when localities aren't held accountable for violating requirements that are needed by the Americans with Disabilities Act. In 2022, in fact, the city of Newark actually sued their local and county boards of elections to demand that all polling places during the 2022 primaries are made accessible. At that time, though, a state judge refused to issue an order compelling these boards of elections to do this and make all these polling places accessible. The judge said that they expected the BOE to just voluntarily comply with the ADA, even though they hadn't been doing this. And this just goes to show how important it is for voters to have a wide variety of tools available to them to challenge policies and decisions that make voting really inaccessible for their communities. Next slide. So the chronic issues that New Jersey voters face make it much more difficult for voters, and particularly voters of color, to easily cast their vote. And you can see the impact of these barriers in the 2020 voter registration and turnout rates. So as you can see from these statistics, in 2020, the registration and turnout rates for voters of color were much lower than for white voters. And this matters because voters select lawmakers who represent them, their communities, and their interests. So when these barriers to the ballot keep voters of color from voting, it also weakens their power to impact policy change. Next slide. And the impact of that is visibly seen in New Jersey. Although New Jersey is one of the most diverse states in the country, but its legislature doesn't reflect the diversity of the state at all. Out of 120 state senators and members of the assembly, 70% are white and non-Hispanic, and 2/3 are male. This is despite the fact that over 48% of the population is people of color, and over half of the state is women. When you have an unrepresentative and unreflective legislative body, that body is less likely to respond to the needs of voters, and especially voters of color, especially when considering policies that tackle real disparities that people and their communities face. And New Jersey has some of the starkest racial disparities in the country. So for example, in 2021, the poverty rates in New Jersey were 15.7% for Black residents and 18.2% for Latino residents. This is compared to just 6.5% for white residents. And the racial wealth gap, if you look at New Jersey, is actually even more staggering. The median net worth for a Black family is $17,700. For Latino family, that median net worth is $26,100. In comparison, the median net worth for a white family in New Jersey is $322,500. It's just absolutely enormous. And that's not all, right? As I mentioned before, New Jersey has the worst racial disparity rate in the country among its incarcerated population. So I think what this shows is that New Jersey residents need tools to help change the conditions that create and sustain these staggering racial disparities. And equal and expanded access to voting and democracy measures help provide these tools. Next slide. Fortunately, New Jersey does have a relatively good recent track record in having pro-democracy progress. So over the past handful of years, the state has passed measures to help restore the right to vote and help make back access to the ballot easier. In 2019, for example, 175 years after that 1844 felony disenfranchisement law, New Jersey finally restored voting rights to more than 83,000 people on parole and probation. The state has also passed legislation to limit police presence near polling sites, and it's passed a slate of very popular pro-democracy tools that makes it easier for every eligible voter to access the poll. So for example, early voting, automatic voter registration, and online voter registration. All of this, don't get me wrong, all of this is very good progress, and it's encouraging that the state's strengthening its democracy by expanding voter access to the ballot. But the thing is, it's not enough. Different communities within the state still have unequal and different access to the polls and to their right to vote. And as federal voting rights protections weaken, New Jersey is going to need to step in and protect its voters, and especially voters of color, even further. With that, I now pass it to my fellow speaker, Adam Lioz.
Hi, everybody. Can we have the next slide, please? And one more, please. Hi, my name is Adam Lioz, and I am Senior Policy Counsel with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, or LDF. LDF is the nation's oldest racial justice legal organization working for an America where dignity is sacred, power is shared, and thriving is the standard. And since our founding in 1940 by Thurgood Marshall, LDF has focused on promoting and protecting voting rights for Black Americans. And since 2021, LDF has focused on state voting rights acts as our top affirmative voting rights priority at the state level. And I'm thrilled to be here today with our partners at the Institute and the Harvard Election Law Clinic to talk about exactly why. Next slide, please. So I'm going to touch on how the New Jersey Voting Rights Act fits into the national landscape. So I'll talk a little bit more about the Federal Voting Rights Act, talk about what a state voting rights act is and isn't, talk about a brief history of the evolution of these laws and their impact, and then touch on New Jersey's opportunity to lead right now. And the key thing is that through enacting a New Jersey Voting Rights Act, New Jersey has the opportunity to become a national leader by meeting a critical local need. Next slide, please. So as Nuzhat touched on, for nearly 100 years after Reconstruction, Black people were locked out of the political process through laws and a reign of terror known as Jim Crow. And there have been several attempts through civil rights laws to address voting discrimination in 1957, 1960, 1964, but they weren't up to the challenge. And finally, after John Lewis crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge and folks were viciously beaten by police, Congress acted and passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, as Nuzhat said, this month, 58 years ago. And the VRA is often referred to as the crown jewel of the civil rights movement, and perhaps the most effective voting rights or civil rights legislation ever passed. And you can see on the slide some of the provisions that the law included at its passage and as it evolved over time. And at the heart of the law was the preclearance protection. And preclearance is based on the simple principle that when it comes to a matter as fundamental as the right to vote, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so the purpose was to prevent discrimination before it occurs by requiring jurisdictions with a history of discrimination to obtain approval from a federal official before moving forward with a voting change. And the preclearance protection against discrimination was extremely effective for decades. The Department of Justice blocked more than 3,000 voting changes that could have been discriminatory over the years. Next slide, please. But unfortunately, over the recent decade, the Supreme Court has weakened substantially the Voting Rights Act. And it started in 2013 with the Shelby County versus Holder Act, where we just passed the decade anniversary of that unfortunate case. Shelby essentially gutted the preclearance protection by striking down the framework to decide which jurisdictions were subject to its protections. And you can see that from the slide that afterwards states moved forward to pass discriminatory laws in the wake of Shelby. And you can, I refer you to LDF's report, Democracy Diminished, which lays out the many ways in which these formerly covered jurisdictions have moved forward with discrimination. Just a few examples are the states of Texas, Alabama, and North Carolina moved forward with strict discriminatory voter ID provisions almost immediately after the Shelby County decision. Then in 2021, the Supreme Court weakened the other pillar of the Voting Rights Act. So the preclearance was Section 5 of the Act, which provided that kind of proactive prophylactic protection. The other pillar is Section 2, which provides nationwide protection against discriminatory voting laws. And the Supreme Court weakened that provision of the law in the Brnovich case in 2021. So state voting rights acts will be critical even after Congress acts to restore and strengthen the Voting Rights Act, but they are especially important in this context today. Next slide, please. So what is and isn't a state voting rights act? So as we are using this term today, a state voting rights act is a law that focuses on protections against racial discrimination in voting that are akin to the Federal Voting Rights Act and build upon it. And I want to distinguish that from other laws that are great and necessary that set minimum standards for election administration, many of which Nuzhat mentioned, some of which we're still fighting for in New Jersey. These are great and important laws, but they're just different than what we're talking about today. There are several pillars of a strong state voting rights act, and they're listed out here on this slide. So those include those prohibitions against voting discrimination across the state that are akin to Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. It includes the preclearance protection akin to Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act that we lost in Shelby. It includes language access requirements that go beyond the minimum requirements of Section 203 of the Federal Voting Rights Act. It would include a protection against voter intimidation, which exists at the federal level through the Voting Rights Act, but most states do not have a civil cause of action against voter intimidation, and that's needed at the state level. It includes a statewide database to bring together in one place all kinds of information about elections, demographic information, districting, election results, election rules. And this is essential both to promote best practices across the state and also to make the rest of the law more enforceable, and eliminates the burden of having to file Freedom of Information Act requests in dozens of places in order to figure out what's going on across the state with regard to election rules. And finally, there's a provision called the democracy canon. And this is basically an instruction to judges to, whenever possible, interpret the law in favor of voters, in favor of access to the political process. So a strong New Jersey Voting Rights Act will have all of these provisions and potentially more. Next slide, please. So in recent years, we've seen growing momentum for state voting rights acts, especially in the last 5 years. So California started things off in 2002 by passing the California Voting Rights Act, which was focused on fighting the problems with at-large elections. So an at-large election is where everyone votes for all of the seats. And so even a bare majority can drown out the voices of any minority population, even if there's a substantial population of minority voters. They're not able to elect any candidates of choice potentially in an at-large election. So California's Voting Rights Act is targeted at that specific problem. Then in 2018, Washington State passed an act that also targets vote dilution, but both in the at-large context as well as for districts. Washington State has made some improvements to that law this year in 2023. In 2019, Oregon filed with a law that fought vote dilution in the context of school boards and school districts. And then Virginia passed a more comprehensive law in 2021, which provided a range of protections. In 2022, New York State passed what was then the most comprehensive law in the country and the first state to include a robust pre-clearance protection at the state level. And then just this year, Connecticut has now enacted the most comprehensive state voting rights act in the country. It is the first law to put together all of the key elements that I outlined on the previous slide, including that robust pre-clearance protection. And as you can see on the bottom, there are several states that are actively considering moving forward with state voting rights acts right now. And the key is that these laws have been getting stronger over time, culminating in Connecticut's law this year. Next slide, please. So the best place to look for impact of state VRAs is California, because it's now been on the books for more than 20 years. And we can see that many jurisdictions have voluntarily shifted away from those potentially discriminatory at-large election systems to give voters a chance to elect their own candidate of choice in districts. We've seen that city councils across the state, as a result, have become more diverse. And importantly, we've seen that voter turnout disparities in many cases have gone down, because it turns out that when you have a legitimate chance to elect a candidate of choice, you'll be more motivated to participate in the political process. So there's a lot of potential for state VRAs to have real-world impact. Next slide, please. Importantly, state voting rights acts are on firm legal ground. So in 2020, the Ninth Circuit upheld California's Voting Rights Act. Just this year, the Washington Supreme Court unanimously upheld the Washington State Voting Rights Act against the constitutional challenge. There is some pending litigation in California right now before the California Supreme Court, but that's more about how the act is construed rather than whether it is constitutional. And then I want to say a few words about two very important Supreme Court cases from this term. The first one is Allen v. Milligan. This was a case about redistricting in Alabama, where the state packed the Black voters in the state into one congressional district, even though they make up almost 28% of the population and should have at least 2 out of 7 congressional districts where Black voters can elect candidates of choice. In this critical case, which LDF argued at the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. It did not alter the framework for how that section is applied to vote dilution cases. And it also made clear that it's permissible to depart from that particular framework. And that's critical because, as Ruth will talk about in a few minutes, the State Voting Rights Acts depart, and New Jersey Voting Rights Act departs from that framework in important ways to make it more accessible and cleaner for voters to win vote dilution cases when they're facing discrimination. Also, I want to mention Moore v. Harper. This is the Supreme Court case that rejected the radical independent state legislature theory and made clear that state courts will still have a robust role in protecting voting rights, even with respect to congressional elections. And this is important because that's exactly what state voting rights acts would do, is that we'd be going to state court to protect Voting Rights Act. So the combination of the Allen v. Milligan and the Moore v. Harper cases means that there's a green light for the State Voting Rights Act strategy to move forward. And that's exactly what we are looking to do here in New Jersey. Next slide, please. So right now, New Jersey has the opportunity to become a national leader by meeting a critical local need. At a time when too many states are moving backwards, we've seen a backlash against voter turnout. Robust voter turnout from Black voters and other voters of color in the 2020 election has led to a backlash that's rooted in white supremacy and a rash of anti-voter laws across the country. That has continued this year. But New Jersey can move forward instead of backwards. New Jersey can be the 7th state to pass a Voting Rights Act and the 6th since 2018, and in the process protect more than 1.4 million Black residents and more than 4 million residents of color across New Jersey. New Jersey can complete the tri-state trifecta. So join New York and Connecticut and complete the tri-state trifecta for state voting rights acts. And at the same time, join New York and Connecticut as the only states with robust pre-clearance as part of their state voting rights acts, so making it the strongest acts in the country, while also competing for completing the race to the top that we have going on, where these acts are getting stronger and stronger. New Jersey really has a choice right now. New Jersey can lead or fall behind as other states continue to pursue this strategy. So as Black voters face the greatest attack on voting rights since the Jim Crow era, and as Congress struggles to find the will to restore and strengthen the Federal Voting Rights Act, we need New Jersey to lead by example. And LDF looks forward to working with the Harvard Election Law Clinic, the Institute, and lots of New Jersey-based partners, along with elected leaders in the state, to put New Jersey at the forefront of state voting rights protections. And with that, I'm very happy to turn it over to my colleague, Ruth Greenwood at the Harvard Election Law Clinic to get deeper into the New Jersey Voting Rights Act.
Thank you, Adam. Hello, everybody. Yes, if we could go to the next slide. I'm Ruth Greenwood. I'm the director of the Election Law Clinic here at Harvard Law School. We were started up 2 years ago with the mission of training the next generation of election lawyers using both litigation and advocacy. We try to bring novel academic ideas into the practice of election law. We aim to build power for voters, not politicians, and we recognize that the struggle for voting rights is a struggle for racial justice. And you can see some of our amazing students there on that slide. Okay, we can go to the next slide. As Nuzhat mentioned in my introduction, most of my career I've been litigating and multiple times under the federal and the Washington actually State Voting Rights Act. And I thought I would just start with a little, part of the reason I've come to advocacy is because I realized that the rules need to be fairer for people of color who have been left out and left behind. And so, you know, we had seen what California had done years ago and the great effects that it had. And then Washington passed their Voting Rights Act, and we were able to use that to litigate the first case under that act and bring justice in a much shorter amount of time in a much fairer way. So I just thought I would come back here to the 15th Amendment to the Constitution and just remind you all what it's about, right? It's about the right to vote not being denied or abridged on account of race. That's what we are trying to do through the Federal Voting Rights Act and through state voting rights acts. If we could go to the next slide, please. So under I'm going to structure this as going through some of the problems with the Federal Voting Rights Act and how the New Jersey Voting Rights Act can improve upon that. So the first thing is that we no longer have federal pre-clearance. Both Nuzhat and Adam have mentioned the Shelby County v. Holder decision, which is 10 years old now. It used to be the case that places that had such a long history of discrimination weren't allowed to enact laws with respect to elections before they had been pre-cleared. Now, even though New Jersey wasn't covered, under a strong New Jersey Voting Rights Act, places like those that the Department of Justice has sued in recent years, where we know that there are problems, could be subject to a not an onerous process, right? But a process whereby they will have to make sure that they think through the racial implications of any laws they change with respect to elections before they enact them. If we go to the next slide. That shows you the breakdown. Okay, next, sorry. So yeah, what's the solution? Here it's relatively straightforward, right? Create a pre-clearance regime within New Jersey. As Adam mentioned, there are already 2 states that have created pre-clearance regimes, and New Jersey can become part of the tri-state trifecta to do that. And it would include, looking at histories of discrimination, issues of segregation, and discrimination in particular with respect to voting. And a pre-clearance regime, there's plenty of experience at the national level. It existed for 40 years before it was destroyed. And it's something that we hope that New Jersey can incorporate. Okay, next slide, please. And if you just click one more time, this shows you a chart from maybe unsurprisingly, the University of Michigan, which is why it's blue and gold. Section 2 is the provision, so what I talked about before with pre-clearance, that was Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. One of the other main sections that was used in litigation successfully over many years is Section 2, that tries to prevent vote dilution and denial. Essentially, it reiterates the promise of the 15th Amendment. If you look at this chart, yellow is successful. Bright yellow means, yes, we did it. We struck down the vote dilution or vote denial provision. And so you'll see on the left-hand side that in 1982 to 1991, right after the Voting Rights Act was amended to clearly apply to vote dilution, we had a lot of successful cases. And then as you go through the decades up to the most recent decade, you get less and less successful cases. It is harder to win. And partly that is because of changing demographics, because you're required to have a fairly segregated population to win under the Federal Voting Rights Act. But partly also it's because the Supreme Court has been cabining Section 2. Milligan was a wonderful decision. We are so happy that it upheld how Section 2 applies. But the Section 2 of today is not the same as that was passed in 1982. So if we go to the next slide, there are some things that New Jersey can do to be more successful than the Federal Voting Rights Act. The first is to allow what we call crossover and coalition district claims. And sort of put simply, a crossover claim is where you have a minority community that can vote with white voters to elect a candidate of choice. There are many places where a 40 or 45%, let's say Black district, would be able to elect a candidate of choice of the Black community. We call that a crossover district. That's something that you can't get, you can't always get through the Federal Voting Rights Act. And then also coalition district claims. We know that people of color sometimes vote together, Black and Latino voters, Latino and Asian, Black, Latino and Asian voters. If there's sufficient information on the ground to support it, a strong New Jersey Voting Rights Act would allow for coalition claims. You'll see another solution is to allow plaintiffs multiple ways to prove a claim. Sometimes there isn't enough data on the ground to be able to use the traditional test that's used under the Federal Voting Rights Act, which is called ecological inference. And so what a New Jersey Voting Rights Act could do is allow for the use of the totality of the circumstances test. This allows more flexibility to prove discrimination that we often know exists, but we can't prove with specific data. And that gets us to the third solution here, which is to actually require that there be a statewide database, including information that you would need to show that there are things like racially polarized voting. This would mean going forward, there would be more data, but it won't help for now when there's been a history of not enough data being available. Okay, so next slide, please. Another issue with the Federal Voting Rights Act is just the remedies process. When you strike down something, if you say you've introduced this citizenship requirement or proof of citizenship requirement, that's a problem. If you strike it down, you get rid of it. Then you just go back to normal. But if you say, hey, this system of at-large elections is a problem and you strike it down, you need to replace it with something. And under the federal law, a lot of deference is given to the jurisdiction to choose to do whatever it wants. And often what it will do is the absolute bare minimum to get through being compliant. if we move through to the next slide, please, you can see that some of the ways is to stop giving that preference, right? Don't let the city that has a history of discrimination and you've just proven in court is discriminating against people of color, don't let them choose their own remedy. Actually let the court decide what is the best way to remedy this violation. And also, as part of that, a strong New Jersey Voting Rights Act would include a broad list of possible solutions. Things like changing the date of election, right? There's great evidence that having off-cycle non-November elections can really harm people of color. You can increase the size of the city or county council. There are other ways beyond the more limited remedies that have so far been used in federal voting rights cases. If we go to the next slide. Thank you. Another problem with the Federal Voting Rights Act that is very specific to New Jersey is that it only has limited protection for language minorities. It's fabulous that it has protection at all, that's great, but it's limited to Spanish language, certain Asian and certain Native American languages. So I pulled this picture from the New Jersey Secretary of State's website. You can get the voter registration in a couple of languages. But if we can go to the next slide, it turns out, as you probably all know, there are many more language minorities in New Jersey. And so a strong New Jersey Voting Rights Act would allow more languages to be protected, like African languages, Middle Eastern languages, other European languages. And it can also require protections where there are smaller numbers of people in that language minority. The federal bar at the moment is 5%, which, you know, if you're 4.5% of the community, then you're out of luck with the Federal Voting Rights Act. The New Jersey Voting Rights Act would allow broader protections. If we go to the next slide, please. And the last one is with respect to voter intimidation and the spread of misinformation. Adam mentioned that the Federal Voting Rights Act has a protection for this, and it does, and so does the KKK Act of 1871, but it doesn't have civil protections. The picture that I've put here about this security task force is actually from New Jersey in the 1980s, and it led to the DNC versus RNC case that had a consent decree. So from the 80s until the early 2010s, if anywhere in the country there was a suggestion that there might be voter intimidation in advance of an election, parties could go into court and use that consent decree to try to stop that intimidation or misinformation. That consent decree was ended. And so now around the country, you have to use things like the Civil Rights Act, the Enforcement Act, which is the KKK Act, or the Civil Rights Act, or the Voting Rights Act. But by putting a protection against both intimidation and misinformation into the New Jersey Voting Rights Act, we can set up procedures to make it quicker and easier to identify and stop in advance things like these happening to disenfranchised people on election day. If we could go to the next slide. Oh, there it is. That's the solution. I apologize. And if we can go to the next slide. The last thing I'll just mention before we get to that is that Adam mentioned a democracy canon. So one of the things that doesn't exist in the Federal Voting Rights Act is a general presumption that you are trying to interpret any statutes to enfranchise as many people as possible. And that's something that a democracy canon would include in New Jersey. Okay, I hand it back over to Nuzhat for questions.
Thank you, both Adam and Ruth. Your parts of the presentation were genuinely so informative. I learn every time I talk to you guys as well. So thank you all for listening to the presentation and the webinar, the substantive portion of it. All of the information that we have mentioned and gone through today can be found in the NJVRA Now report. On this slide, you can go to this bit.ly link and you can access the NJVRA Now report in its entirety. You can find more. You can find out more about the NJVRA campaign at www.njvra.org. And if you have any questions about the campaign, or you or your organization would like to be involved with it, please feel free to reach out to me at the Institute. This is going to be an ongoing campaign. And so we're excited that this is sort of like our beginning stage. We have this report now, we've started the conversation, and now the goal really is to follow through and make sure that New Jersey does pass the NJVRA. So with that being said, we have reserved some time for Q&A, and I've seen that you guys have asked a lot of really great questions in the chat function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the questions that we received out loud, and then either I will take that question or Adam will or Ruth will, and we will try to get through as many as we can. So we can, I think you guys should have that information, so we can go ahead and turn the PowerPoint off. Okay, so the first question that we received was, will the proposed Voting Rights Act seek to include people who are incarcerated? And I can take that question. So the NJVRA at its heart is really about shoring up the right to vote for those who already have that right. Because of rights restoration and our 1844 No More campaign, as I mentioned earlier, in 2019, those on parole and probation were included again within that right, and those going forward who are on parole and probation are folded into the group of people who can vote. So those individuals are included in the NJVRA and in all of its protections. Unfortunately, in New Jersey, those who are incarcerated do not have the right to vote at the moment, although the Institute fully supports voting rights for incarcerated individuals. So the Institute currently has a campaign. If you are interested in that topic, we have a current campaign called the 1844 No More campaign. It's led by my excellent colleague, Ron Pierce, as well as a coalition of impacted people and partners. And so that particular question and that particular part of it is run through a separate campaign. But to answer the question simply, the NJVRA is about protecting the right to vote for those who currently do have that right. So the second question we received was, considering the diversity of New Jersey, what are some practical ways to make election materials available in dozens of languages? And I'm going to let Adam take that question.
Sure. So one of the things that's great about New Jersey is language diversity and diversity overall, and the NJVRA would address that by lowering the thresholds that would require bilingual or multilingual language assistance, and also, as we stated, making them available to more languages than the Federal Voting Rights Act currently does. That should not, however, result in any individual jurisdiction having to provide materials in dozens of languages. There are thresholds for people who live in that community and both speak that particular language and are also limited English proficient. And so each individual jurisdiction would only likely have to provide a few different languages, which makes it manageable. In addition, we definitely encourage the Secretary of State at the statewide level to provide as much support as possible to those jurisdictions. And so for many election kinds of election materials, it would be more efficient to print materials or make them available statewide. And that can also make it practical to provide this kind of support for as many languages as possible across the state.
Great, thanks, Adam. The next question we have is, do you have data on wait times in the most privileged suburbs? There are never any wait times whatsoever. I'm going to let Ruth take that question.
Yeah, so your inclination is right. Generally, in privileged white places, there are much less wait times than in poorer and places with less white people. The MIT elections performance index actually looks at this, and I was just looking up, the Bipartisan Policy Center released a report. So if you want to look at that, you can go to the MIT elections performance index and look up New Jersey, but also with respect to the discrepancies specifically within New Jersey, this is the type of evidence that we would gather if we were going to litigate under this act, right? We would consider that to be an impingement on the right to vote if it's harder in one place compared to another place, and we would take that evidence to court to try to get more polling places, expand access. There's lots of different types of remedies we would try to get.
Thank you, Ruth. The next question we have is, so in light of the fact that several states, I can't read, are strengthening voting rights protections, is there much chance that the US Congress would revamp the Voting Rights Act? Adam, I'll let you have this.
Sure. So in addition to focusing on state voting rights acts for the Legal Defense Fund, I also do most of our federal voting rights advocacy. So happy to take that. The short answer is yes. Congress absolutely has to strengthen and fully restore the Voting Rights Act to repair the Shelby County decision, repair other decisions. There is a bill that would do that. It's called the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. It has not yet been reintroduced this Congress, but Congresswoman Sewell, who's the lead sponsor, has said that she's going to reintroduce that bill soon. Now, the longer answer is that it's unlikely to pass in this Congress. So unfortunately, the majority in the House of Representatives, instead of supporting legislation like the John Lewis bill, recently introduced an omnibus anti-voter bill called the ACE Act, which would actually put in place some of the worst practices across the country and put additional barriers and obstacles in front of people's access to the ballot. So we have to deal with the reality that right now this bill is not likely to move forward in the House of Representatives, but it is absolutely imperative and it remains a priority for pro-voter leaders in Congress. And so the game right now is to continue to build support and pressure so that in the next Congress, we have the window and the opportunity to pass the John Lewis bill, along with the Freedom to Vote Act, which is the bill that would provide minimum standards for voter access across the country. Whether you're in Maryland or Mississippi or New Jersey, you should have access to same-day voter registration and lots of other types of pro-voter policies. Those bills together for the federal level would accomplish that, and we're eagerly awaiting the next window of opportunity for that.
Thank you, Adam. So the next question we have is, what are the biggest obstacles to passing an NJVRA and what can we do about that? I'm happy to take that question. So I think I have two responses to this. First is that we need a strong version of the NJVRA that includes the provisions that Ruth and Adam were talking about earlier: strong pre-clearance requirements, very strong and strengthened language access requirements, voter intimidation protections, prohibition against voter intimidation, all of those things, right? So there is currently, the NJVRA has been introduced. It was introduced a year ago, and what we want to see is a stronger version that has all of those protections incorporated in. So very first, we want the strongest version of this bill that we can have. And then I think the second answer I have to this is that, state VRAs are a growing movement. And so what we need is legislators in the New Jersey legislature to understand that there is a need for a state voting rights act in New Jersey, that it's not, yes, we've had good progress in pro-democracy measures over the past couple of years, but that's not where New Jersey stops. Just because New Jersey is, not considered a deep red state or whatever it might be, it doesn't absolve New Jersey of putting in strong voter protections that are tailored to New Jersey populations. So we need to advocate for the NJVRA and make sure that state legislatures know that this movement is growing, that the movement is growing here in New Jersey, and that we need the NJVRA, and that there is an audience for it, there is hope for it. So we need to be contacting our legislators and making sure that it gets on their docket and it is prioritized in the coming session. And so in order to do that, we're happy to, as I mentioned, we have this campaign that is ongoing. So if you would like to join the NJVRA campaign or the coalition, please feel free to reach out to me. And in the interim, we will have calls to action and other ways to reach out to your legislators and let them know that this is something that New Jersey not only wants, but needs. So the next question that we have is about voter turnout. Is voter turnout calculated based on the number of registered voters or eligible voters? And I'll let Ruth answer.
That is an excellent question. And the answer, sorry to be a lawyer, is it depends. So if you look up the Election Assistance Commission, they keep the best sort of report of this. It's called the Election Administration and Voting Survey, EAVS, EAVS. They actually report it in 3 different ways. So they report it by registration, they report it by CVAP, citizen voting age population, and then they also try to make an estimate of the voting eligible population, because as we know, it is not always the case that if you are a citizen of voting age, you are eligible to vote. But I think the general way that it's reported, and I guess Nuzhat, you'll have to check, but I think it's probably as a percentage of CVAP. So it's an estimate of the percentage of eligible voters.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions that are focused around legislators, so I'll sort of answer those all together. Which legislators are currently involved in advancing the NJVRA, and are there legislators that, you know, as audience members, you should reach out to? First of all, always reach out to your legislators to make sure that they know that this is something that is important to you, and this is something that you and or your community want and need. The legislators that are currently involved in the NJVRA, we have we have a great group of champions for voting rights who have already signed on to the bill. So if you look up the bill, or I think we can provide the link to it, it lists who the current sponsors of the bill are in the Assembly as well as in the Senate. So you can take a look at that list to see who has signed on and who has yet to sign on to the bill. And I think the sort of the final question that we have is, I think sort of goes back to the campaign itself and how do we move it forward? So the question asks, what's our call to action after this call? How can chapter organizations partner with the Institute and with LDF as they have on other initiatives to move this forward? As I mentioned, we have a website that you can go to that will list a lot of, we have our fact sheet on there. We will have a report on there. So if you go to njvra.org, we also have a call to action little tool there that will help you text your legislators, that will help you call them. And as this campaign gets going, that's what we need to do. We need to reach out to legislators and make them know that New Jersey Voting Rights Act is something that we want and need in New Jersey. So we welcome you to join the campaign. Reach out to me, to Adam, to Ruth. We can get you added onto the coalition. But really, it really is about making sure that those in power know that this is something that New Jersey not only wants, but it is something that New Jersey needs, and that we need to follow the lead of other states that have joined this movement, this growing movement, and make sure that we have it here as well. So I think that, oh, and one last question, when will this webinar be posted? We are going to post it on, the Institute will have it up on its website, as well as our socials as soon as possible. So we'll work on that. But again, I would like to thank Adam and Ruth for joining us and working on this incredible report. Again, you can find the report on the Institute's website, and you can read through all of it. It makes the case for the NJVRA, just as we've gone through in this webinar. And I want to thank everyone who has asked questions and participated. We really appreciate your tuning in.